For most of the last 3 decades of the 20th century, as you heard, I was a foreign correspondent, and often I would be asked in one or another country where I was after one of our mass shooting atrocities why such things kept happening and why we Americans needed so many guns anyway. And I would, attempt to give an answer, but I realized I didn't really know myself. And I began to think about the idea of doing research into the history of the Second Amendment when I had time. And the result, after I retired 3 years ago, turned into this book. And I found, doing the research, things that surprised me. Maybe they shouldn't have surprised me, but you learn a lot of things when you're in school and then you forget them. One was that the colonists had always had the right to keep and bear arms right from the start in Jamestown, for hunting, for self-defense, and of course, importantly, for defense against attacks by Native Americans, who soon found that these visitors were intending to stay a long time and take away their lands. That right was connected with the duty to serve in militia, to come to the common defense, in other words, not just for self-defense. You didn't have to be a militia member to have a gun, but if you had a gun, you had to be ready to serve in the militia. And they regulated the weapons. Many militias in New England and elsewhere, of course, the local authorities who ran them had lists of names and of the guns that the people who had the guns had. They needed to know that in order to know, what kind of a militia force could they bring to bear at any point when Indians attacked, or the British did, or the French, or whoever happened to be causing a need for community defense. And the facility and the familiarity that Americans had with firearms won us the Revolutionary War, I think. We wouldn't have a United States of America if it hadn't been for Americans' familiarity and facility with firearms. But the right that we have always had has always been subject to regulation. And after independence, it continued to be. It came as a surprise to me to find that Western towns in 19th century, like Dodge City, required visitors to leave their guns at the edge of town or with the sheriff. The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited, a hand-lettered sign in the main street of Dodge City proclaimed. You can see it in a photograph in Adam Winkler's fine book, Gunfight. Concealed carry was banned in Louisiana, Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Virginia, and Alabama in the early 19th century. Concealed carrying was seen as cowardly. Real men didn't conceal their weapons, they wore them openly. How times have changed. The laws, of course, have also changed since then. We now have concealed carry laws going the other way in many states, laws that were adapted because of the fear of violent crime, which was a scourge between the late 1960s and the late 1980s, undeniably. It's still with us today, of course, but it's dramatically down. The NRA is still, though, scaring people to death with the idea that it's so bad out there that you must have a firearm with you to protect yourself because the police aren't always around. When people like me point out that violent crime is way down, the NRA says that's because criminals don't know which members of the general public might be packing heat, so they lay off assaults. No scientifically accurate study has been done to show convincingly cause and effect. Carrying guns lower crime rates. There are people who argue that, but I haven't seen a really good scientific study that proves it. I think somebody ought to do one, seriously. On the other side, people like Mayor Michael Bloomberg in New York City, where I live, say that strict gun control laws that keep people like me from buying and owning guns are the reason for the decline in gun violence in New York City in recent years. And I just don't understand that. I keep pointing out that the people who perpetrate gun violence are not the law-abiding people who would apply for a license and try to get permission to have a gun in New York City, and mostly are denied because the police say you don't have a good convincing reason to need one. Those aren't the people who are involved in the street shootings that keep happening in New York City, even though there are fewer of those now than there were 20 years ago. But they're mostly people using illegal guns and even community guns, guns illegally owned, guns that are stashed somewhere where anybody who knows where they are can get them and use them illegally. Keeping guns out of the hands of people who should not have access to them, who everybody agrees should not have access to them, that should be the aim of all gun control laws, not keeping guns out of the hands of as many law-abiding people as possible. There are plenty of loopholes in existing legislation, as Mayor Bloomberg keeps saying, that I think should be tightened up. And first of them, I would suggest, is the one that exempts as many as 40% of all gun purchases from the requirement for the buyer's names to be cleared by the FBI's NICS system, the so-called gun show loophole that exempts private sales, not just at gun shows, but all private sales of firearms. Anybody who buys a gun privately from a private owner doesn't have to go through the background check, and that really ought to be an urgent priority, closing that loophole. It's one of the ways that so many people who use guns criminally in the streets of New York, Chicago, and other big cities manage to get hold of guns. Another way is straw purchasing, which ought to be severely punishable and rigorously prosecuted. It hasn't been. Most gun violence in big cities is committed with handguns, not rifles, and whatever new gun control measures are proposed or discussed after Newtown should concentrate mainly, I think, on what can be done to make possession and carrying of so many handguns safer, not just concentrate on so-called assault rifles. Assault rifles figure disproportionately in mass shootings like Newtown and in confrontations with law enforcement. Past federal gun control laws, federal ones, have come about with difficulty, and any federal laws that come out of Newtown will also, I think, have a difficult time before they're passed. In the past, it came after a public revulsion over violence reached a peak. In 1968, we got a law, the gun control law, after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, for example. And the question now is Newtown 2012 a moment like 1968? Well, Senator Feinstein has said she's going to introduce a bill in the Senate to reinstate the assault weapons ban that lapsed after 10 years in 2004. And it appears that her bill will propose tightening it up from what it was then to make it impossible to sell rifles with pistol grips or collapsible stocks, or rifles and handguns with large capacity magazines that hold more than 10 bullets. Anyone who has one of these already would have to register it with the federal government under the National Firearms Act. That's the 1934 law that made fully automatic machine guns and sawed-off shotguns not impossible, but very difficult and expensive to buy and own. And it was later amended to also require fingerprinting and photographs of the owners and registry with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Well, that 1934 law, when it was passed, was reasonably popular. It was aimed at the syndicate, organized crime, who were spraying bullets around the country at a prolific rate during Prohibition as they sold illegal booze to a population made thirsty by the misguided experiment of Prohibition. You can today technically still own a Tommy gun if you comply with all these restrictions, but few people go to the trouble. And you haven't heard the NRA complaining, at least not loudly, about why we can't just go out and buy fully automatic machine guns if we want to. Well, no machine guns were used in Newtown, no machine guns in the Aurora movie theater last summer, not in Tucson when Gabrielle Giffords was shot, not in Virginia Tech where 32 people were killed by the shooter who killed himself. But semi-automatic rifles or handguns with magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds were involved in all of them. The 2008 Supreme Court decision in the District of Columbia versus Heller case found, as you've heard, that the right protected by the Second Amendment was an individual right. It concluded that the District of Columbia's ban on handguns in the home violated the right because handguns were the weapon most commonly used for self-defense, and self-defense was the most important purpose protected by the right. I don't agree that the Second Amendment was primarily about or written for concern about self-defense. The wording in Heller was that the amendment, quote, surely elevates above all other interests the right of law-abiding, responsible citizens to use arms in defense of hearth and home. Well, I don't see it that way. I think the amendment recognized or acknowledged a pre-existing individual right to use arms for those and other purposes. It did not, quote, confer an individual right to keep and bear arms, as the Heller opinion, I think, wrongly states. Concern about individual self-defense did not figure to any meaningful extent in the debates about the amendment at the time it was proposed and adopted at the end of the 18th century. Gun rights enthusiasts often quote the minority in Pennsylvania that explained why it dissented from ratification of the amendment because it didn't mention self-defense or hunting. But they forget this was a minority view, after all. Same with earlier objections to the language in that state's guarantee of the right to keep and bear arms for the common defense. People in two towns there, Northampton and Williamsburg, wanted the language including the word self-defense as well as common defense. But it was only those two towns. Everywhere else, the wording as common defense sailed through, and the state constitution was approved with that wording. This was before the Second Amendment, obviously. The Second Amendment's purpose was a political one, to reassure the people who feared that the new federal government that was being established by the Constitution would be too powerful, that it could run wild, that it could become despotic or tyrannical was the word, and trample the rights of the states. In particular, that a standing federal army, if one should be established, could run amok under a power-mad general or president and suppress American liberties. So the intent of the amendment was to reassure people who were going to decide on the Constitution that there would be protection for the right of the states, the ability of the states to maintain the state militias. The militias would be the deterrent both to any attempt to set up a standing federal army and to any despotic ambitions federal authorities might have. The language is often criticized for being antiquated, but to me it's perfectly clear. Had the founders meant to create a right to keep and bear arms, they would have said a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the people shall have the right to keep and bear arms. But they already had that right in common law. It was not the right only of people who were in the militia, as I've said. And that it should not be infringed has never meant that it could not be subject to regulation. But I can imagine that if Congress passed and the president signed a law banning semi-automatic assault rifles and pistols and magazines altogether, the Supreme Court would soon be finding itself asked to rule that the law was unconstitutional, just like the district's ban on handguns or Chicago's in the McDonald case. I can see this argument coming when I read in the New York Times that Stephen Halbrook has done the homework and found that there are 3.3 to 3.5 million AR-15s that had been made in the United States from 1986 through mid-2012 and had not been exported. In other words, they were here already in private hands or available for purchase. And that would be enough, I would imagine, he thinks, for a court to find that such weapons were in common use and would fall into the same trap that the DC ban on handguns had.